My name is Shelby Parker. I am 30 years old. On a Tuesday afternoon in Kansas, the wind off the prairie was blowing dust against the windows of my grandfather's farmhouse. His funeral reception was winding down in the kitchen. Church casseroles sat cooling on the counter, and the coffee in the large metal urn had gone bitter. That was when my mother pointed to the front door and said, "You got your goodbyes. Now get out." My father picked up my suitcase, walked past me without making eye contact, and set it out on the porch. In the living room, my brother raised a glass of bourbon, toasting to his new role as the sole heir of a $19 million logistics company. They were celebrating my eviction while the dirt on Grandpa Leonard's grave was still soft. They thought they had won. They thought putting my luggage in the cold was the end of the story. They did not notice that the executor of the estate was standing quietly in the hallway. They did not notice that she waited until their cars pulled out of the driveway, locked the heavy front door from the inside, and handed me the keys. Before I tell you what the executor said and the ruin my family unknowingly drove toward, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Front Porch Revenge. But only do that if you know what it feels like to be punished for being the one person who actually kept the wheels turning. Drop your age and where you are listening from in the comments. Now let me take you back to that kitchen outside Salina, to the moment the illusion of my brother's empire began to crack. The farmhouse smelled of stale coffee, wool coats, and wilting lilies. Dozens of relatives moved through the first floor, speaking in the hushed, reverent tones people adopt when someone important has died. Grandpa Leonard was an institution in our part of Kansas. He built Parker Prairie Distribution from a single loading dock into a regional freight hub. I spent the last 8 years working in his warehouse. I managed the logistics, untangled the supply chains, and kept the trucks running on time. My older brother Travis wore the tailored shirts and took clients to lunch. Travis carried the title, but I carried the weight. 3 days before the funeral, Travis fired me. He did not ask for a transition plan. He did not ask about the commercial freight contracts I managed after hours through my own independent company, Prairie Line. He just wanted to prove he was the new authority. He assumed my presence was a threat to the coronation he was planning for himself. Standing by the kitchen island, I watched my family orchestrate their takeover. My mother, Carol, moved through the room like a general surveying conquered territory. She collected empty paper plates and directed the remaining church guests toward the door, subtly pushing the crowd out so the inner circle could claim the space. My father, Dennis, stood near the refrigerator. He kept his hands in his pockets, offering polite nods to passing relatives, carefully avoiding my gaze. My mother stopped in front of me. She held a foil-covered baking dish in one hand. She did not offer a word of comfort. She did not ask how I was holding up after burying the man who actually raised me. "You need to leave," Carol said, her voice pitched low enough to avoid echoing into the living room, but sharp enough to cut. I looked at her, keeping my posture straight. My suitcase was resting near the hallway stairs. I had packed it earlier, anticipating that I would need to stay at a hotel in Wichita rather than sleep in my childhood bedroom. I did not expect them to physically force me out before the funeral flowers had even begun to droop. "You got your goodbyes?" Carol continued, shifting the baking dish to her other hand. "Now get out. We have family business to handle, and Travis does not need you lingering around causing tension." I turned my head and looked at my father. Dennis looked at the linoleum floor. He stepped forward, picked up my suitcase by the handle, and walked toward the front door. He opened the heavy wood, stepped out into the biting Kansas wind, and deposited my bag onto the porch boards. He walked back inside and closed the door, returning to his spot by the refrigerator without speaking a single word in my defense. From the living room, the sound of ice clinking against glass drew my attention. Travis was standing by the stone fireplace. He was surrounded by Aunt Phyllis, Uncle Ray, and a half-dozen other extended relatives who were eager to secure their standing with the presumed new patriarch. Travis raised a glass of amber bourbon. To Grandpa Leonard, he announced, his voice carrying the smooth, unearned confidence of a man who believed the world was handed to him by right. He built something lasting, and I promise all of you, Parker Prairie Distribution will stay in capable Parker hands. We are going to expand. We are going to modernize. The relatives murmured their approval, raising their styrofoam cups of coffee and glasses of water in a unified salute. Standing right beside Travis was his wife, Kendra. She was running her manicured hand along the edge of Leonard's antique oak bookshelf. She looked around the farmhouse with the assessing gaze of a real estate developer sizing up a demolition project. She was already planning where to put her new furniture. She was mentally tearing down my grandfather's life before his obituary was even printed in the local paper. I did not shout. I did not throw my coffee cup against the wall. A loud emotional outburst was exactly what my mother wanted. Carol needed me to act unstable. She needed me to cause a scene so she could look at the relatives, shake her head in manufactured pity, and justify my expulsion. She wanted to frame me as a greedy, jealous sister who could not handle her brother's success. I knew how to read a room, and I refused to give her the ammunition. I took a slow step forward, moving past my mother. I looked at the group gathered by the fireplace. "Who told you this house was yours to clear?" I asked. My voice was not loud, but the steady, even tone sliced through the polite chatter. The relatives shifted uncomfortably. Aunt Phyllis looked down at her shoes. Uncle Ray took a sudden interest in the ice melting in his cup. Travis lowered his bourbon, a flash of irritation crossing his handsome face. He opened his mouth to deliver a patronizing dismissal, but Carol stepped between us, acting as his shield. "Do not start this today, Shelby." Carol warned, her tone dripping with practiced condescension. "Your grandfather is gone. Travis is taking over the company and we are managing the estate. You are embarrassing yourself. Just go back to Wichita and let us handle things." They ignored the core of my question. They assumed that because Travis was the eldest male, the transfer of power was an automatic, unwritten law. They mistook their own social confidence for legal authority. I glanced around the perimeter of the room. My cousin, Melanie Price, stood near the doorway leading to the dining room. She was holding a stack of funeral programs. When I asked the question, Melanie hesitated. Her eyes darted from my face to Travis, a flicker of doubt breaking through her usual compliance. She was the only relative who seemed to realize that no official paperwork had been read and no lawyer had spoken. Then I saw her. Standing in the shadowy corridor near the pantry was Janet Whitcomb. Janet was a retired accountant, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had managed Leonard's private books for 3 decades. She was named the executor of his estate years ago. The rest of the family treated her like hired help, offering her polite smiles while quietly waiting for her to leave so they could start dividing the assets. Janet was not leaving. She stood with her arms crossed over her dark wool coat, watching the interaction with an expression of profound, quiet endurance. I shifted my gaze from Janet to the wooden key hook mounted on the wall just beside the pantry frame. For as long as I could remember, an old heavy brass keyring hung on that specific hook. It held the keys to the farmhouse, the detached garage, and the original loading dock doors of Parker Prairie Distribution. The hook was empty. My heart registered a slow, deliberate beat. The family was busy performing their victory lap, eager to push me out into the cold so they could finalize their narrative. They believed power belonged to whoever claimed it the loudest. I realized in that moment that I did not need to fight them for the room. I just needed to let them leave. I turned back to my mother. I did not offer a rebuttal. I did not demand an explanation from my father, who was still staring at the kitchen floor. I simply nodded, turning my back on the people who raised me. I walked toward the front door. The sound of my boots against the hardwood floor felt heavy and final in the tense silence of the farmhouse. I grabbed the brass handle, pulled the heavy door open, and stepped out onto the porch. The Kansas wind hit me instantly, carrying the scent of dry earth and impending frost. My suitcase sat exactly where my father had abandoned it, resting against the wooden railing. I pulled the door shut behind me, the latch clicking into place. I stood on the porch, wrapping my coat tighter around my shoulders, feeling the sting of the rejection. I had given 8 years of my life to the family business. I had covered for Travis's mistakes, shielded the company from supply chain disasters, and loved my grandfather fiercely. My reward was a suitcase on the porch and an eviction notice delivered over a plate of cold casseroles. I walked down the wooden steps and stood near the gravel driveway. I did not go to my car. I waited. Over the next 30 minutes, the farmhouse emptied. Relatives filed out the front door, offering me tight, sympathetic smiles that felt more like apologies for their own cowardice. Aunt Phyllis and Uncle Ray hurried to their sedan, eager to escape the awkward tension. Melanie Price walked out, pausing briefly as if she wanted to say something, but she just offered a small wave before climbing into her truck. Finally, my parents and my brother emerged. Carol walked arm in arm with Kendra, discussing paint colors for the living room walls. Travis carried a cardboard box filled with what looked like Grandpa's desk accessories. Dennis trailed behind, locking the front door behind them. They walked to their luxury SUVs, completely ignoring my presence in the driveway. Engines turned over, tires crunched against the loose gravel, and one by one the vehicles rolled down the long dirt road leading back to the highway. They left me standing in the cold, convinced I had been permanently erased from the Parker family equation. The dust from their tires settled. The prairie grew quiet, the only sound the rustling of dry stalks in the adjacent fields. I looked back at the farmhouse. The front windows were dark. The porch was empty. Then the heavy wooden front door opened. Janet Whitcomb stood in the doorway. She held the old brass keyring in her right hand, the metal glinting in the fading afternoon light. She looked out at me, her expression shedding the polite neutrality she had worn inside. She stepped back, motioning for me to return to the porch. She waited until I carried my suitcase back up the wooden steps. She reached out, pulled the heavy door shut, and turned the deadbolt, locking us inside the quiet house. Janet looked at me, her voice steady and clear. "Shelby, do not get in your car yet." The quiet inside the farmhouse settled heavy and thick the moment the lock clicked into place. For the past 3 days, the rooms had been filled with the low hum of visitors, the clatter of silverware, and the heavy scent of church basement casseroles. Now the silence felt almost physical. Janet turned away from the front door and walked down the hallway toward the kitchen. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not offer a comforting hug or a sympathetic smile regarding my mother's behavior. She moved with the steady, measured pace of a woman who had spent 30 years balancing ledgers and sorting through the messy financial realities people left behind. I followed her, leaving my suitcase out on the porch boards, where the Kansas wind was already picking up a bitter evening chill. We bypassed the kitchen island where crumpled napkins and half-empty styrofoam coffee cups cluttered the countertops, and stepped into the formal dining room. The space smelled strongly of the white funeral lilies leaning precariously in a tall glass vase at the center of the old farm table. Next to the flowers sat a paper plate holding an untouched slice of pecan pie. Beside that was Grandpa Leonard's favorite chipped ceramic coffee mug, left exactly where he had set it down before his final trip to the hospital. Outside the dark window panes, the sprawling wheat fields stretched out into the black prairie night, isolating the house from the county highway. Janet stopped at the head of the table. She reached into her dark wool coat and pulled out a thick black leather binder. She set it down on the scratched oak surface. Next, she retrieved a slim silver digital voice recorder and placed it carefully beside the binder. Finally, she opened her palm and dropped the heavy brass key ring. The metal hit the wood with a dull, solid sound. It was the same key ring that had been missing from the pantry hook. I stared at the brass keys, my mind trying to catch up to the moment. I assumed Janet was performing a final sentimental duty. In families like mine, the favored son inherits the bank accounts and the real estate, while the quiet daughter is handed a keepsake to soften the blow. I expected her to tell me that Leonard wanted me to have his old truck keys, or perhaps the key to his workshop out back. A small token of affection to carry back to my apartment in Wichita. "Take a seat," Shelby Janet instructed, pulling out a wooden chair for herself. I remained standing, wrapping my arms tightly across my chest. My hands were still shaking slightly from the confrontation with my mother. What is this Janet Travis just finished telling half the county that he is taking over the company? My dad just carried my luggage out the door. Janet rested her hands flat on top of the leather binder. She looked up at me, her eyes sharp and clear. "Your grandfather left you the farmhouse," she said. Her voice was perfectly level, devoid of any theatrical build-up. "He left you the controlling interest in Parker Prairie distribution, and he left you the operational authority your brother just toasted himself for in the other room." My knees gave out. I reached for the back of the nearest dining chair and sat down hard, the wooden seat creaking under the sudden weight. I stared at Janet, waiting for the punchline. I waited for her to clarify that I was merely a minority shareholder or that I was being granted a small symbolic percentage of the profits. Janet did not offer a correction. She pushed the brass key ring an inch closer to me across the table. "I don't understand," I managed to say, the air thinning in my lungs. "Travis has the title. He runs the front office. My parents." "Your parents assume the loudest voice in the room owns the room," Janet interrupted mildly. "Leonard updated his estate plan 18 months ago. He brought in outside counsel from Topeka. He underwent a full documented medical evaluation to prove he was entirely of sound mind, specifically to prevent anyone in your family from contesting his decisions later. I am the executor of his estate, and my legal authority to grant you access to this property and those business shares is active as of this afternoon." I looked down at the keyring. I did not feel a sudden rush of euphoric victory. I did not feel the triumphant thrill of a lottery winner. I felt the immediate crushing weight of a collapsing structure. The number frequently whispered among the relatives was 19 million. That was the presumed valuation of Parker Prairie Distribution. For years, Travis had walked around the warehouse floor, acting as though that number sat in a liquid checking account with his name on it. But I managed logistics. I spent my days routing trucks and untangling commercial freight delays. My brain did not see a pile of cash. "That valuation is not liquid," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "It is tied up in diesel concrete and payroll. It is commercial real estate debt, depreciating forklifts, and outstanding accounts receivable." Janet watched me carefully, a small, knowing expression softening her features. "It is a heavy operational burden," she agreed. I picked up the brass keyring. The metal felt cold against my palm. I thought about the warehouse just outside of town. I thought about the fluorescent lights buzzing over the loading docks, the smell of exhaust, and the people who relied on those docks to feed their families. "What happens to the workers?" I asked, looking back up at her. "Travis fired me on Tuesday. If he thinks he is in charge, he is going to start making changes by Monday morning. Does he know about this binder?" Janet let out a slow, quiet breath. "No. The formal reading and the transfer of shares require a scheduled legal process. Your family left here today fully believing the transition of power follows the traditional unspoken Parker hierarchy. They think your brother inherited the kingdom simply because he wears a tie to the office." She leaned forward, tapping a finger against the leather cover of the trust. "But look at what you just did, Shelby. I hand you the keys to a $19 million estate, and your very first instinct is not to ask how much cash is in the bank. You asked about the obligations. You asked about the dock workers." Janet offered a brief, sad smile. "That is exactly why Leonard put your name on the paper. He knew Travis only saw the prestige. He knew you were the only one who actually understood the machinery." The reality of the inheritance settled over me, replacing the initial shock with a profound, quiet ache. The gift was a validation of every invisible hour I had poured into my grandfather's business. But it also carried a devastating implication. It meant Leonard had seen the dysfunction clearly. He knew my parents would enable my brother's arrogance. He knew Travis would steer the company into a ditch for the sake of his own ego. My grandfather had intentionally placed me directly in the line of fire. He had handed me the authority to save his life's work, knowing full well that taking control would require me to stand against my entire family. I looked toward the living room, where the faint indentations of my relatives' shoes still marked the carpet near the stone fireplace. They had stood in this house drinking bourbon, celebrating my expulsion. They had demanded my silence and expected my submission. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet no longer belonged to them. I tightened my grip on the brass keys. The serrated edges pressed sharply into my skin, a grounding physical reminder of the responsibility I now carried. "When does the transition happen?" I asked, shifting my focus to the practical steps ahead. If I walk into the warehouse on Monday and tell Travis to step aside, he will laugh me out of the building. My mother will tell the whole town I have lost my mind with grief. We will follow the legal timeline." Janet assured me, her tone shifting back to the precise, methodical cadence of an accountant. "The attorneys will issue the formal notifications, but Leonard wanted you to have physical access to the farmhouse tonight. He wanted you to have a secure place to operate." Janet reached out and opened the thick cover of the trust binder. The pages were dense with legal phrasing, asset schedules, and notarized signatures. She bypassed the initial declarations, flipping through the heavy paper until she reached a specific section near the middle of the stack. Protruding from the top of the page was a bright red sticky flag. She flattened the binder against the oak table, her hand resting over the typed text. She did not look at the legal jargon. She looked across the funeral lilies, meeting my eyes with a grave, steady intensity. Janet turned the binder to the flagged page and said, "Before you sleep here, you need to know why Leonard did this. Parker Prairie is bleeding somewhere." I drove back to Wichita later that night. The highway was empty, the dark Kansas fields rushing past my windows. I needed the distance. I needed the quiet of my own space to process the weight of the brass keys resting in my coat pocket. By 5 the next morning, I was sitting at the small kitchen table in my apartment above a closed bakery storefront. The distant rumble of a freight train rattled the window panes. A mug of bitter, lukewarm coffee sat next to my open laptop. The brass keys rested near the trackpad, a heavy reminder that my life was about to change. But my immediate focus was on the screen. My parents had always viewed my career as a cute administrative hobby. They told their friends I helped out at the warehouse pushing paper for Travis while he handled the real business. They never asked what I actually did when the warehouse doors closed. They did not know that for the past 5 years I had been building Prairie Line Logistics. Prairie Line was my independent contract business. I launched it after hours operating out of this very apartment, brokering freight lanes and securing regional carriers that Parker Prairie Distribution desperately needed but could not negotiate on its own. I built the relationships. I monitored the dashboards. I secured the rates. I was scanning the morning routing schedules on my Prairie Line portal when my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text message from Travis. "You are no longer authorized at Parker Prairie. Stay out of company systems." I read the message twice. The petty, arrogant nature of the text was typical for my brother. He wanted to ensure I knew he held the power. He wanted to slam a digital door in my face to match the physical one our father had closed at the farmhouse. I did not reply. I took a sip of my cold coffee and looked back at my screen. 5 minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID displayed the main dispatch line for a major regional carrier based out of Kansas City. I had managed their contract through Prairie Line for 3 years, securing steady, reliable capacity for Parker Prairie's outbound shipments. I answered on the second ring. "This is Shelby." "Shelby, it's Mike from KC Freight," the dispatcher said. His tone was clipped, lacking the usual easy morning banter we exchanged when routing trucks. "I just got an automated notification that your administrative access to the Parker Prairie portal was revoked. Is that accurate?" "My brother is making some internal adjustments to the staff roster," I said carefully, trying to buy time while I opened Mike's specific carrier dashboard on my laptop. "Well, the adjustments are hitting my board," Mike replied, his voice tightening. "We cannot honor Parker Prairie rates if you are not the contract manager. Those discounts were negotiated based on the volume guarantees and the load times you establish through Prairie Line. If you are not verifying the manifests, my drivers are not sitting at those docks." I stopped typing. I heard the sentence exactly for what it was. It was not a personal insult directed at my family. It was a critical supply chain failure unfolding in real time. "Which lanes are suspended, Mike?" I asked, shifting my posture, the fatigue of the funeral vanishing instantly. "Everything outbound to Omaha and Des Moines," he confirmed, the sound of a busy dispatch floor echoing behind him in the background. "My system pulled the trucks the minute your authorization dropped. Travis just sent over a blanket email demanding we hold the rates under his signature. He does not have an active contract with us. You do." The reality of Travis's arrogance clicked into place. He thought firing me was a simple administrative flex. He thought he could strip my access claim my title, and the trucks would just keep rolling because the sign on the building said Parker Prairie. He had no idea that the trucks rolled because of the secondary safety net I had built. "I understand," I told Mike, keeping my voice level. "I am not asking you to run freight without a verified contract. Hold the lanes. I need to get up to Selena and see the warehouse floor before I can authorize any new movement. Let me know when you are back in the system," Mike said, his tone softening slightly. "We want the freight, Shelby, but we don't work blind." He hung up. I set the phone down next to the brass keys. The scope of the bleeding Janet had warned me about was beginning to reveal itself. My family had not just discarded my emotions at the funeral. By firing me, they had discarded the very labor that protected the company's cash flow. They had severed the artery. I opened the primary Parker Prairie login screen on a separate browser tab. I entered my credentials. The screen flashed red. Account disabled. Contact system administrator. Travis had actually done it. He had locked me out of the company portal, completely blind to the fact that his action was actively severing ties with the carriers. I could have fixed it immediately. I could have bypassed the Parker Prairie system, logged into my Prairie Line portal, and authorized the freight manually under my own company's name. I had the legal authority to do so. I had the keys to the entire operation sitting right next to my coffee mug. But I hesitated. If I used my new inheritance to override Travis right now, the entire family would explode. My mother would accuse me of seizing power while they were grieving. She would tell the church, the neighbors, and the extended family that I was a ruthless opportunist who used Grandpa Leonard's death to steal my brother's job. I wanted to handle this privately. I wanted to drive to Selena, look at the outbound lanes, and figure out how to patch the holes without humiliating my brother in front of the staff. I was still operating under the assumption that if I just worked hard enough and fixed the problems quietly enough, they might eventually see my value. It was a dangerous, ingrained habit. I closed the disabled Parker Prairie tab and focused on my own business portal, monitoring the damage. I watched as 3 more regional carriers flagged their accounts, awaiting contract verification, because my name had vanished from the system. Then a high-priority alert flashed across the top of my screen. It was an automated message from a cold storage partner we used for our most lucrative seasonal contracts. The facility managed overflow inventory for specialized food distributors. They required strict 24-hour confirmation windows. I clicked the alert. The message was brief and devastating. Parker Prairie holiday hold released due to missing Shelby confirmation. The fallout from my silence began an hour later. I was still sitting at my kitchen table in Wichita, trying to trace which carriers had dropped their holiday holds, when my phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID displayed Aunt Phyllis. I set down my coffee mug and answered. Aunt Phyllis rarely called me before 9 in the morning unless someone was in the hospital or a family scandal was actively brewing. Given that we had just buried Grandpa Leonard, I assumed she was checking in. I was wrong. "Shelby." She started, her voice pitched with that specific, hushed urgency reserved for church prayer chains. "I just got off the phone with your mother. She was shaking after what you did at the funeral yesterday." I closed my laptop slightly. "What I did?" "She told us how you caused a scene during the reception." Phyllis continued, not waiting for an explanation. "She said you demanded the keys to Leonard's house right in front of everyone while they were trying to mourn." "Shelby, I know grief makes people do strange things, but trying to lock your own family out of their father's home is just cruel." My chest tightened. Carol had not wasted a single minute. The moment they drove away from the farmhouse, leaving me on the porch, my mother had begun calling the extended family. She had crafted a narrative that completely inverted reality. She omitted the part where my father physically carried my suitcase out the door. She left out Travis's arrogant toast. Instead, she painted me as an unstable, greedy daughter trying to hoard the estate before the ink on the obituary was dry. "I did not take anything, Aunt Phyllis," I said, keeping my voice steady. Janet Whitcomb stayed behind to handle the property. Phyllis sighed, a sound heavy with manufactured pity. "Your mother is devastated. She just wanted to go over there today and collect some of Leonard's personal things. You need to call her and apologize." She hung up before I could respond. My phone buzzed again almost immediately. This time it was Uncle Ray. He skipped the polite greeting entirely. "Travis is just trying to keep Leonard's company from being carved up," Ray said, his tone thick with defensive anger. "He is under a lot of pressure stepping into those shoes. He does not need his little sister throwing a tantrum and trying to play landlord with the family farm. You need to let him lead right now." I ended the call without answering. The strategy was brutally transparent. My mother knew she had no legal authority over the house. She knew Janet held the power. But Carol operated in a world where social standing was currency. She was launching a preemptive strike, weaponizing the church circle and the extended relatives to shame me into submission. She expected me to crumble under the weight of the family gossip, hand over the keys, and quietly accept the villain role she had assigned me. Leaving the farmhouse quietly had been a massive miscalculation on my part. I thought refusing to argue in front of the funeral guests would protect my dignity. Instead, my silence simply gave Carol a blank canvas to write her own story. I scrolled through my recent calls and dialed Janet. She answered on the first ring, her voice crisp and alert. "Janet, my mother is telling the family I locked them out of the house," I said, staring at my unpacked suitcase resting near the kitchen island. "She is telling everyone she is going over there today to clear out boxes." Janet did not sound surprised. "As the executor, I legally secured the property and transferred physical access to you," she replied calmly. "Carol has no authority to remove business papers or boxed records from that house. The estate is not a free-for-all. You control the lock, Shelby." I hung up, gripping the phone tightly. I looked at the brass keys sitting on the table next to my cold coffee. They were no longer just a heavy, symbolic inheritance. They were the only physical boundary I had left. 10 minutes later, the screen of my phone lit up with a direct call from my mother. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. I needed to ensure my voice betrayed none of the panic currently tightening my throat. "Hello, Mom," Shelby Carroll announced, her voice echoing slightly. I could hear the faint ambient chatter of other people in the background. She was not alone. She had placed the call on speakerphone, performing the role of the tragic patient matriarch for an audience of sympathetic relatives. "We are heading over to the farmhouse this afternoon to pack up the family boxes," Carol declared, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "We need to go through Leonard's things before the estate lawyers try to tie everything up. I expect you to be cooperative. You do not get to lock grieving people out of their own memories." The sheer audacity of the demand momentarily stunned me. She was actively framing a raid on my grandfather's business records as a sentimental journey. She was trying to override the executor's legal handoff using the cover of collective mourning. I did not argue. I did not defend my actions or accuse her of spreading lies to Aunt Phyllis. Engaging in a screaming match while she had an audience would only validate the erratic, unstable image she was selling. "Do not enter Grandpa's house without me there," I said firmly. There was a brief, stunned silence on the other end of the line. The background chatter stopped. "Excuse me," Carol snapped, dropping the sweet facade. "I am leaving Wichita now," I told her, my voice level and unyielding. "The house remains locked until I arrive. Do not go inside." I ended the call. I grabbed the brass keys and my heavy winter coat. I practically ran down the stairs to my car. The drive from Wichita to Salina takes an hour and a half under good conditions. I pushed my sedan 10 miles over the speed limit, watching the flat winter wheat fields blur past my windows. My stomach churned with a toxic mix of anxiety and regret. My attempt to handle the transition privately, to avoid embarrassing my family, had backfired completely. By trying to protect them, I had allowed them to turn the farmhouse into a contested battleground. They were using their grief as a crowbar, hoping to pry open the doors before I could establish any real authority. I crossed the Saline County line, my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to make my knuckles ache. I was 20 minutes away from the property when my phone chimed with an incoming text message. I pulled over onto the gravel shoulder of the highway and opened the screen. It was a photograph from Carol. The image showed her silver SUV parked directly in front of Leonard's farmhouse, blocking the wooden porch steps. Behind her car, I could see my father's truck and Travis's polished company vehicle. They had all mobilized. Beneath the photograph was a single threatening sentence. "We are here. Open the door, or I will tell everyone what you are doing." I threw the car into drive, my tires spitting gravel as I pulled back onto the highway. The text message burned in my mind. My mother was essentially holding my grandfather's house hostage, threatening to detonate my reputation within the family if I did not surrender the keys immediately. She believed the fear of public shaming would paralyze me. 10 minutes later, I turned onto the dirt road leading to the farmhouse. The biting prairie wind whipped dry dust across the windshield. As the house came into view, the scene on the porch looked less like a grieving family and more like a tactical raiding party. Carol stood near the front door. At her feet rested 4 large empty plastic storage tubs. Dennis leaned against the wooden porch railing, staring out at the flat horizon, deliberately avoiding the tension. Travis paced the length of the porch, checking his phone with agitated, jerky movements. Kendra stood close to him, arms crossed tightly over her expensive wool coat. Aunt Phyllis and Uncle Ray had also arrived, standing slightly apart from the immediate family, serving as the designated audience my mother required for her performance. I parked my car behind my mother's SUV, turned off the engine, and stepped out into the freezing wind. As I walked up the driveway, the crunch of my boots on the gravel drew their attention. Travis stopped pacing. He looked down at me from the elevated porch, his expression hardening into a familiar mask of arrogant condescension. "It is about time," Travis said, his voice loud enough to carry over the wind. "Do you have any idea how ridiculous this looks, Shelby? You are acting like a landlord with grief issues. Open the door so Mom can get what she needs." I did not answer him. I kept my hand in my coat pocket. My fingers wrapped tightly around the brass keyring. Carol stepped forward, nudging one of the empty plastic tubs with the toe of her boot. "These are family records," she announced, her tone shifting to that dramatic wounded pitch she perfected for church audiences. "You do not get to hoard them. Your grandfather's legacy belongs to all of us, not just the granddaughter who decided to throw a tantrum after the funeral." I looked at my father. He kept his gaze fixed firmly on the distant wheat fields. He was the one who had physically carried my suitcase out this very door yesterday. Now he was standing silently while my mother tried to force her way back inside to ransack his own father's files. His refusal to intervene stung deeper than my mother's accusations. Before I could reach the bottom step, the sound of tires on the dirt road broke the tension. A dark gray sedan pulled into the driveway, parking neatly beside my car. Janet Whitcomb stepped out. She wore the same dark wool coat from the day before, carrying a slim leather folder under her arm. She did not rush. She walked up the gravel path with the steady, unbothered calm of a woman who dealt exclusively in facts, not family theatrics. Carol stiffened. "Janet," she said, her voice tightening, "this is a private family matter. We are just gathering some personal items." Janet stopped at the base of the porch stairs. She did not raise her voice, but her words carried undeniable authority. "Leonard did not leave this house to committee vote," Carol Janet stated firmly. She opened her leather folder and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "As the executor, I am providing you with formal written notice. Personal keepsakes can be scheduled for removal at a later date. However, all business records, financial documents, and operational files remain secured on this property under the direct authority of the designated heir." Janet handed the paper to my mother. Carol stared at the document, the color draining slightly from her face. The social pressure she had relied upon was entirely useless against a notarized legal directive. Travis stepped down one stair, pointing an angry finger at Janet. "My sister has no authority over Parker Prairie files," he snapped. "I run that company. Those records belong at the warehouse with me." Janet looked at him, completely unfazed by his aggression. "The estate documents state otherwise, Travis." I walked past Janet, ascending the wooden stairs. The family parted slightly, forced to yield the physical space. I approached the heavy front door, pulling the brass keys from my pocket. The metal clinked sharply in the tense silence of the porch. I inserted the key, turned the deadbolt, and pushed the door open. The stale smell of funeral lilies and cold coffee still hung in the hallway air. I stepped over the threshold, turning back to face my family. I stood squarely in the doorway, blocking the entrance. I looked down at the empty plastic tubs resting near my mother's boots. "You are not bringing those inside," I said, my voice steady. Carol's eyes flashed with genuine fury. She realized she had lost control of the narrative in front of Aunt Phyllis and Uncle Ray. The grieving mother routine had failed against the physical reality of the keys and the executor's presence. She opened her mouth to argue, but I did not give her the space. I remembered the vulnerability I had felt standing in this exact spot yesterday, watching my father put my suitcase in the cold. I was not that woman anymore. "You can come in, Mom," I offered, keeping my tone perfectly level. "You can walk into the living room. You can take the framed photo of you and Grandpa from the mantel. But no one is stepping foot inside Leonard's office today." Carol stared at me, her chest heaving with shallow, angry breaths. She looked at Dennis, but he remained silent, refusing to meet her eyes. She looked at Travis, who was glaring at the brass keys in my hand as if they were stolen property. Slowly, Carol stepped over the threshold. She walked past me without a word, her boots clicking against the hardwood floor. She went straight to the living room mantel, picked up the silver-framed photograph, and walked directly back out the door. She did not look at the kitchen. She did not look toward the closed door of Grandpa's office at the end of the hall. She marched down the porch stairs, bypassing the empty plastic tubs, and got into her SUV. Dennis followed her, his head bowed. Travis lingered on the porch. He looked from me to Janet, the reality of the situation finally piercing his arrogance. He realized the keys were not a symbolic gesture. He had lost the first practical battle over the estate, and he had lost it in front of the relatives he had been trying to impress. "You think this makes you the boss, Shelby?" Travis sneered, zipping his coat. "You think holding a house key means you can run a logistics company? You have no idea what you're doing." I kept my hand firmly on the doorframe. "I will see you on Monday, Travis." He scoffed, turning his back on me and grabbing Kendra's arm. They walked quickly to his company vehicle. Aunt Phyllis and Uncle Ray, clearly uncomfortable with the shifting power dynamic offered, muttered excuses and hurried to their own car. Within minutes, the driveway was empty again, save for Janet's sedan and my car. I stepped back out onto the porch. The adrenaline that had carried me through the confrontation began to fade, leaving a dull, heavy ache in my chest. I had successfully defended the house. I had protected Leonard's files. But I had been forced to stand in my grandfather's doorway and treat my own mother like a hostile intruder, while the house still smelled like his funeral. Janet walked up the stairs and stopped beside me. "You did well," she said quietly. I looked down at the empty plastic tubs Carol had left behind on the porch boards. What were they hoping to find in his office? I asked, the exhaustion seeping into my voice. Before Janet could answer, my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I pulled it out, checking the screen. It was a call from Earl Haskins, the veteran floor manager at Parker Prairie Distribution. Earl had worked for Leonard for 20 years. He was the only person in the warehouse who commanded as much respect as my grandfather. I answered the call. "Earl Shelby." Earl's rough, gravelly voice came through the speaker, tight with urgency. "You need to get up here right now." "I'm at the farmhouse," I said, confused. "The warehouse is closed for the weekend." "I know," Earl replied, the sound of a forklift echoing faintly in the background. "But I came in to check the holiday staging area. You need to see the outbound lanes before your brother explains them away." The drive from the farmhouse to the warehouse took less than 20 minutes. The early morning sky over Salina was a flat, bruised gray, promising another bitter drop in temperature. I parked my car near the chain-link fence bordering the employee lot. The heavy scent of diesel fumes and wheat dust settled in the cold air, a familiar grounding smell I had known since I was old enough to follow my grandfather across the concrete floors. I unlocked the heavy steel side door and stepped inside Parker Prairie Distribution. The high bay fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh industrial glare. The facility was massive, a sprawling grid of steel racking and concrete aisles designed to move commercial freight across the Midwest. A few forklifts beeped in the distance, executing routine morning maneuvers. The air was sharp and cold near the loading docks where the overhead heaters struggled against the draft. I walked past the break room, my boots echoing against the concrete. I was heading straight for the outbound staging area when a sharp voice stopped me. "Shelby, what are you doing here?" Kendra stepped out from the main office hallway blocking the aisle. She wore a tailored wool blazer that was entirely impractical for a warehouse floor, clutching a metal clipboard tightly to her chest. She looked exactly like someone trying very hard to perform the role of a manager without understanding the script. "I need to see the floor, Kendra," I said, keeping my pace steady, expecting her to move. She did not step aside. She raised the clipboard slightly, a physical barrier matching her defensive posture. "Travis said, 'You do not work here anymore,'" Kendra stated, her voice tight with unearned authority. "He revoked your clearance on Tuesday. You cannot be past the visitor lobby without an escort." I stopped. The instinct to back down to avoid causing a public scene in the middle of a shift flared up instantly. For 8 years I had navigated around my family's egos, smoothing over their mistakes and letting them claim the credit just to keep the freight moving. I was terrified of looking like I was exploiting my grandfather's death to seize control of the building. Before I could formulate a polite, non-confrontational response, a heavy, worn work boot stepped into the aisle behind Kendra. "She may not work for Travis," a deep, gravelly voice echoed. But Leonard left her the building. Earl Haskins stepped out from behind a towering stack of shrink-wrapped pallets. He wore a faded Carhartt jacket and a thick canvas beanie, a stark contrast to Kendra's polished blazer. Earl had run the floor for 20 years. He knew every crack in the concrete and every driver's first name. Kendra spun around, her eyes widening. "Earl, you cannot just bypass upper management," she stammered, gripping her clipboard tighter. Travis gave explicit instructions regarding security. "I am not asking anyone to violate work rules," I said, finding my voice. I stepped closer, moving past the hesitation. "I am inspecting operational risk under ownership authority." Kendra looked from me to Earl, realizing she had entirely lost the floor. The title Travis gave her meant nothing to the people actually moving the freight. She lowered the clipboard, offering a tight, humiliated glare, and stepped aside. She hurried back down the hallway toward the executive offices, no doubt scrambling to call my brother. I did not wait for Travis to arrive. "Come on," Earl said, waving a thick-gloved hand toward the far end of the building. I followed him down the main corridor, nodding to 2 dock workers who were restacking a broken pallet near door 4. I noticed the overhead dock heaters were turned off in their section, leaving them working in freezing drafts. I noticed the fatigue around their eyes. I noticed the bright red holiday priority labels peeling off the corners of the shrink wrap. The rhythm of the warehouse was off a subtle, chaotic lag that happens when the people at the top stop paying attention to the foundation. Earl led me to the outbound staging lanes. This was the critical nerve center of the distribution hub, the designated concrete grids where outbound holiday shipments were grouped by destination before loading. This close to Thanksgiving, the lanes should have been overflowing, stacked 2 pallets high with seasonal inventory heading to Kansas City, Wichita, and Overland Park. The lanes were nearly empty. I stopped at the edge of the yellow-painted safety lines. A vast stretch of bare concrete stared back at me. A few scattered pallets sat isolated in lane 3, poorly wrapped and missing routing slips. "What is this?" I asked, the professional calm slipping from my voice. "This is what happens when someone fires the only person who knows how the routing software works," Earl said bluntly. "Travis came down here Wednesday and told everyone to expedite the Kansas City accounts. He wanted to look like a hero, but he didn't secure the carrier capacity first. The freight was pulled from racking staged and then just sat here when the trucks never showed up." I stared at the empty space, feeling a sickening plunge in my stomach. The damage I had seen on my laptop screen in Wichita earlier that morning was not just a digital glitch. It was a physical crisis. The holiday freight was not delayed. It was completely stalled. "Where is the inventory now?" I asked, walking over to inspect a lone pallet resting near dock door 7. We had to push it back into the deep storage racks to clear the floor for the inbound receiving. Earl explained, rubbing the back of his neck. "Half the holiday stock is buried behind regular inventory." Kendra tried to manage the logistics board yesterday, but she doesn't know the difference between a refrigerated load and dry freight. We lost 3 days of staging. The weight of the inheritance pressed down on me, heavy and undeniable. Leonard had not just left me a title. He had left me the responsibility of cleaning up the wreckage my family created when they confused status with competence. I looked at the 2 dock workers standing nearby. They were watching me, waiting for direction. They did not look at me with the polite, dismissive tolerance my parents used. They looked at me with the practical expectation that I knew how to solve the problem. "Show me the routing manifests," I instructed Earl, dropping the hesitation entirely. "I need to see what is physically missing, not the projections Travis claims we hit." Earl nodded, a grim satisfaction settling over his weathered face. He led me away from the docks and toward the cluster of glass-walled executive offices overlooking the floor. We bypassed the main administrative desks and walked directly into Travis's office. The room was cluttered. Empty coffee cups sat on a polished mahogany desk that Leonard would have never tolerated. The trash can was overflowing with discarded vendor brochures. Earl walked straight to the large dry erase whiteboard mounted on the far wall. The board was divided into columns tracking the major regional accounts. I scanned the rows. The numbers written in red marker were staggering. The volume projections for Kansas City, Wichita, and Overland Park were double the historical capacity of the warehouse. He promised them impossible delivery windows, I said, tracing the red numbers with my finger. "We do not have the dock space to load this much volume in a single week, even if we had the trucks." Earl crossed his arms, staring at the whiteboard. "The problem isn't that the orders are late, Shelby." He pointed to the 3 customer names written heavily at the top of the board. "Those orders are not late," Earl said, his voice dropping into a harsh warning register. "They never existed the way he sold them." I stared at the whiteboard, tracing the red marker lines connecting the impossible volume projections to the specific regional accounts. The air in the office smelled of stale coffee and accumulating dust. Beside the customer columns, written in my brother's unmistakable hurried scrawl, was a heading that made the breath catch in my throat. Shelby Capacity. My name was written in thick, aggressive letters across the top of the board, anchoring the fraudulent delivery promises. Kendra burst into the office, her heels clicking rapidly against the thin industrial carpet. She looked frantic, holding her metal clipboard like a shield. She saw me reading the board and immediately stepped in front of it. "It is just shorthand." Kendra insisted, her voice shrill with defensive panic. "Travis was just mapping out the historical data to motivate the sales team." "It does not mean anything. It means he sold air," Earl said from the doorway. He crossed his arms, watching Kendra attempt to physically block the evidence. "He promised delivery windows that require 3 times the trucks we actually have booked." I did not argue with Kendra. I looked at the desk chair resting empty behind my brother's mahogany desk. It was an old ergonomic mesh chair, the exact model I used to sit in when I worked my shifts tracking the inbound freight. Travis had claimed the office, but he had kept my old chair. Before Kendra could offer another panicked excuse, the heavy black multi-line phone on the desk rang. The harsh electronic tone shattered the quiet tension in the room. The caller ID display flashed a familiar corporate number. It was the main logistics hub for the largest grocery distributor in Kansas City, one of Parker Prairie's most vital legacy clients. Kendra lunged for the receiver, eager to silence the disruption. I moved faster. I stepped around the desk, hit the speakerphone button, and picked up the handset. "Parker Prairie Distribution," I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. "This is Shelby." "Shelby." Thank God, a man's voice boomed over the speaker. It was Mark, the lead purchasing director for the grocery chain. He did not sound relieved. He sounded furious. "Where are my holiday pallets? We have receiving docks sitting empty in Kansas City, and my floor managers are breathing down my neck." I looked at Kendra. The color drained completely from her face. She reached out, trying to press the disconnect button on the console, but I shifted my hip, blocking her hand. "I am looking at the outbound manifests right now, Mark," I said cautiously, trying to assess the blast radius of my brother's incompetence without immediately detonating the company's reputation. "I do not want to hear about manifests." Mark snapped, the frustration vibrating through the small speaker. "Travis promised us expedited delivery. He guaranteed the freight windows on Tuesday. We shifted our entire floor schedule to accommodate the volume. He told us Prairie Line stood behind it." The words landed in the dusty office like a physical blow. Travis had not just lied about the warehouse capacity. He had actively used my independent business to legitimize his impossible promises. He had invoked the reputation I spent 5 years building: the flawless delivery records, the carrier relationships, the strict adherence to contract terms, and weaponized it to secure a sale he knew he could never fulfill. He had chained Prairie Line Logistics to the sinking ship of his own arrogance. I looked at Earl. The veteran floor manager stared back at me, his weathered face tight with grim understanding. He knew exactly what that sentence meant for my livelihood. Kendra stood frozen, her hand still hovering awkwardly near the phone console. She recognized the catastrophic danger of the customer's statement. The narrative that I had abandoned the company was suddenly colliding with the reality that Travis had explicitly promised my continued involvement. I needed to protect my business, but I also understood the immediate danger of declaring open war while the customer was still on the line. If I told Mark that Travis was a liar and a fraud right now, the grocery distributor would pull every contract they had with Parker Prairie by the end of the day. Dozens of warehouse workers would lose their jobs right before the holidays. I took a slow, measured breath. Mark, I said, choosing every word with surgical precision. Prairie Line has not guaranteed anything your company has not signed directly with me. The line fell silent for a long, heavy moment. Mark was a seasoned logistics director. He understood the nuance of the phrasing. I had not explicitly accused my brother of lying, but I had firmly severed my company's liability from the promises Travis made. I had drawn an undeniable legal and operational boundary. "I hear you," Shelby, Mark finally replied, the anger dialing back, slightly replaced by a cold, calculating caution. "So what exactly is moving today? I will send you a revised routing schedule from my Prairie Line email within the hour I promised. It will detail exactly what capacity is verified and available." I hit the disconnect button. The dial tone hummed briefly before the line went dead. I pulled my phone from my pocket and quickly drafted a concise, formal email to the Kansas City distributor, officially clarifying that Prairie Line accepted no responsibility for unauthorized verbal guarantees. I hit send, legally insulating my independent business from the impending fallout. Kendra watched me, her breath hitching nervously. "You are trying to ruin him," she accused, her voice trembling. "You are purposely confusing the customers to make Travis look incompetent because you are bitter. He fired you. I am trying to keep the trucks from turning around." "Kendra," I corrected her, slipping my phone back into my pocket. The heavy, suffocating reality of the situation fully settled over me. My grandfather had trusted me to fix the company. But to save Parker Prairie, I would have to navigate through the landmines my own brother had deliberately planted using my name. The betrayal cut incredibly deep. My family had not simply rejected me emotionally, they had actively attempted to exploit my professional credibility while simultaneously orchestrating my public eviction from the family home. Earl stepped away from the doorway, his eyes fixed on the hallway behind me. Heavy, urgent footsteps echoed against the concrete floor outside. The door swung open violently, banging against the interior wall. Travis stormed into the office. His face was flushed red, his jaw tight with panic and rage. He saw me standing behind his desk. He saw Earl watching him, and he saw the red marker notes on the dry erase board. "Do not touch my customer board," Travis warned, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. Travis did not wait for an answer. He moved quickly around the desk, his presence physically crowding the small space. He grabbed the dry erase eraser and swiped it violently across the whiteboard, smudging the red marker lines into a messy pink blur. "We are moving this to the break room," Travis ordered, his chest heaving as he turned to face Earl. "Get the shift leads, now. I am not having a screaming match in my office where the entire floor can see it through the glass." He marched out of the room, expecting everyone to follow. Kendra hurried after him, looking relieved to escape the enclosed tension. Earl caught my eye, offering a slow, grave nod before stepping out to gather the staff. I looked down at the smudged whiteboard. The evidence of his impossible promises was erased, but the damage was already echoing through the supply chain. I walked out of the office and followed the sound of Travis's heavy footsteps toward the break room at the far end of the facility. The break room smelled of burnt coffee and industrial floor cleaner. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the cheap steel chairs and scratched folding tables. Travis stood at the head of the longest table, leaning forward on his knuckles, trying to project the image of a seasoned executive managing a crisis. Kendra stood slightly behind him, her arms crossed tight. Earl walked in a moment later, followed by 3 shift leads wearing heavy warehouse gloves and high-visibility vests. The men looked exhausted, carrying the physical strain of working on a disorganized floor. Before anyone could speak, the door creaked open again. The Kansas City customer representative walked in. Mark had apparently decided a phone call was no longer sufficient. He had driven down from the regional office, his face tight with anger, holding a manila folder filled with unfulfilled shipping manifests. Travis blanched when he saw Mark, but he quickly recovered, smoothing his expression into a mask of righteous indignation. He turned his focus squarely onto me. "I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what is happening here," Travis announced, his voice carrying clearly over the hum of the vending machine. "Shelby walked out on this company. The moment Grandpa Leonard died, she packed her bags, abandoned her desk, and left everyone stranded right before the holiday rush. Now, she is sneaking back into the building, trying to confuse our customers and sabotage the recovery plan I put in place." The lie hung in the air, heavy and audacious. He was relying on the assumption that the warehouse staff would automatically believe the appointed heir. He expected the shift leads to view me as the selfish sister who bolted during a crisis, framing his own incompetence as a heroic struggle to save the business. I felt a familiar, suffocating pressure in my chest. For years, avoiding conflict had been my survival strategy. Whenever Travis blamed me for a missing shipment or a botched inventory count, I had quietly absorbed the reprimand, fixing the problem behind the scenes while letting him take the credit. Confronting him publicly meant risking a complete family explosion. But I looked at the exhausted shift leads. I looked at Mark clutching the manifests that represented millions of dollars in stalled retail inventory. And I looked at Earl. Earl did not wait for me to find my voice. "You fired her before the funeral, Travis," Earl said, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension like a rusted blade. Travis flinched. He glared at the older man, his jaw tightening. "That is a lie. She quit because she couldn't handle the pressure." Kendra stepped forward, eager to support the narrative. "I was there," she insisted, her voice shrill. "She refused to transition the accounts. She was completely unprofessional." A quiet voice from the back of the room broke the standoff. It was David, a young dock worker, who handled the primary security logs for the electronic gates. He was leaning against the break room doorframe, twisting a pair of work gloves in his hands. "The access removal order came from your terminal, Travis," David said softly, avoiding direct eye contact, but speaking clearly enough for everyone to hear. "You logged the termination code on Tuesday morning. I processed the badge deactivation myself. She didn't quit. You locked her out." The air in the room shifted instantly. The tension did not dissipate. It inverted. Travis stood frozen at the head of the table. The shift leads stopped looking at him with respectful anticipation. They looked at him with profound, calculating skepticism. Mark, the Kansas City representative, lowered his manila folder, his eyes narrowing as he processed the revelation. Travis realized the workers were no longer performing loyalty. His authority built entirely on assumed inheritance, and social bluster was evaporating in front of the very people he needed to command. I took a breath, letting the silence stretch for 1 second longer before I spoke. I did not yell. I did not point fingers. I addressed the room with the practical, measured tone of a logistics manager assessing a damaged load. I should have corrected my family's story the moment it started spreading. I admitted, looking directly at the shift leads. That was my mistake. I let you believe I abandoned this floor, and I apologize for that. I turned my attention to Travis. I kept my hands resting lightly on the back of a steel chair, refusing to match his aggressive posture. "Explain to the room why you removed me from the freight authorization system 3 days before the holiday staging deadline," I said. "Explain how you plan to secure the capacity for the promises you made on that whiteboard." Travis opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked at Kendra, but she had retreated a step, staring at the floor. He looked at Earl, who merely raised an eyebrow, waiting for an answer they all knew did not exist. Travis had no operational plan. He had fired me to prove he possessed the power to do so entirely blind to the mechanical reality of how the warehouse functioned. The public lie had collapsed. I watched the realization settle over the room. The staff saw him not as a grieving grandson carrying the weight of the company, but as an arrogant executive who had recklessly endangered their paychecks. Mark stepped forward, dropping his manila folder onto the break room table. The thick stack of paper hit the surface with a loud, definitive smack. "I don't care about your family drama," Mark stated, his voice hard and uncompromising. He looked directly at me. "Travis told us Prairie Line stood behind these delivery windows. If that was a lie, then Parker Prairie is dead to us. We will pull every contract by noon." The victory I had just secured felt suddenly fragile. I had exposed Travis's lie, regaining my credibility with the staff and forcing my brother into a humiliating silence. But the exposure did not fix the immediate catastrophic problem. The holiday freight was still sitting on the floor, and the grocery distributor was preparing to sever a legacy relationship that Parker Prairie needed to survive. I looked at the shift leads. I looked at Earl. Their jobs, their holiday bonuses, and the future of the warehouse were tied to the same sinking ship my brother had torpedoed. I turned back to Mark, knowing the boundary I had drawn on the phone earlier was about to be severely tested. "We are not dead," I said, my voice steady though my stomach churned with apprehension. "Prairie Line will manage the recovery routing. I will sign off on the revised manifests myself." Travis watched me, a flicker of something dark and resentful crossing his face. He had lost the room, but he realized I was stepping in to clean up the mess he had created. He was calculating how to survive the humiliation. Mark did not look relieved. He crossed his arms, staring at me with the cold, assessing gaze of a buyer who had been burned once too often. "Then you need to tell us by tomorrow morning whether Prairie Line is helping fix this," Mark said, "or whether we walk." The diner on the edge of town smelled of frying bacon, industrial sanitizer, and the heavy diesel exhaust from the wheat trucks idling in the gravel parking lot outside. It was 6 a.m. The harsh fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating the stained coffee rings marking the Formica table where I sat. I smoothed out a crumpled paper napkin, sliding my pen across the rough texture to sketch a revised delivery route. Across from me sat Mark, the Kansas City customer representative, nursing a mug of black coffee. Next to him sat Earl, wearing his heavy canvas jacket, watching me with a look of profound, quiet concern. I tapped the tip of my pen against the napkin. "We can move the perishable pallets by tomorrow afternoon," I told Mark, pointing to the designated loading zone on my makeshift map. "I have 2 carriers with empty backhauls heading toward Overland Park. They can divert and pick up the priority freight. The dry goods will have to wait until Thursday. I am not making false guarantees, Mark. That is what can physically move." Mark looked at the napkin, then up at me. He looked exhausted, the stress of the holiday shipping delays wearing deep lines around his eyes. "You are asking me to accept a 50% delay on inventory that was supposed to hit the shelves yesterday. I am asking you to accept reality," I countered, keeping my voice steady. "Travis sold you air. If you want the freight to move, it moves under my authorization on my timeline using Prairie Line's active carrier contracts. If you want to hold out for the timeline, Travis promised you will be waiting until January." Mark sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. The anger from the day before had burned off, leaving behind a cold, pragmatic business calculation. He knew I was offering the only viable lifeboat. "I will wait until the end of the day," Mark said, his voice flat. "If I do not have a signed, actionable recovery plan from Prairie Line by 5 o'clock, I am pulling the account." He stood up, dropped a $5 bill on the table to cover his coffee, and walked out of the diner without looking back. I closed my Prairie Line notebook, the heavy silence settling over the booth. Earl did not touch his coffee. He leaned back against the red vinyl seat, his weathered face tight with disapproval. "You shouldn't be doing this, Shelby," Earl warned, his voice low enough to avoid carrying to the waitress wiping down the adjacent counter. "The workers are going to lose their holiday bonuses if that account walks, Earl," I said, sliding my notebook into my bag. "I can fix the routing. I have the capacity in my own system." "I know you can fix it," Earl replied, leaning forward, resting his thick forearms on the table. "That is the problem. If you fix this quietly, Travis will say you admitted it was yours. He will tell everyone that his plan was perfect and you only stepped in because you realized you broke it." I looked out the diner window, watching a semi-truck pull onto the highway, its headlights cutting through the early morning fog. Earl was right. The strategic move was to let the shipments fail. The smart play was to stand back, let the customers cancel the contracts, and allow Travis's incompetence to be exposed in a massive, undeniable financial collapse. It would force the family to confront the truth publicly, but my grandfather had not left me the business so I could burn it down to prove a point. He left it to me because he knew I understood the human cost of failure. "The dock workers shouldn't have to pay for my brother's ego," I said softly, turning back to Earl. "They have mortgages, they have kids. If I let Parker Prairie lose the Kansas City account, half the floor gets laid off by Christmas." "They fired you before the funeral," Earl reminded me, his tone hardening. "They packed your bags and put them on the porch. Now you are risking your own independent company to bail them out. You are playing right back into the old pattern, Shelby. You fix the mess, they take the credit, and you take the blame if it falls apart." The truth of his statement felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. For my entire adult life, I had operated as the family's invisible safety net. I had absorbed the stress, managed the logistics, and allowed my parents to believe that Travis was a capable leader. I thought I was breaking the cycle when I claimed the farmhouse and pushed back on the warehouse floor. But by offering a private rescue now, I was making a familiar, costly mistake. I was prioritizing the immediate practical problem over the necessary, painful confrontation. I was trying to save the business without fully exposing the family. "I am going to send an official clarification from Prairie Line," I told Earl, trying to reassure both of us. "I will explicitly state that my company is assisting under new limited terms and that we do not accept responsibility for the unauthorized guarantees Travis made. I will make sure the paper trail is clear." Earl shook his head slowly, a grim, knowing expression on his face. "Paper trails only matter to people who care about the truth, Shelby. Your family only cares about the story." We left the diner shortly after. We left the cold morning air biting through my jacket as we walked to our cars in the gravel lot. I felt the familiar, heavy burden of responsibility settling firmly back onto my shoulders. I was stepping back into the fire, using my own independent business to shield the company my grandfather had left me. I climbed into my car, turning the heater on high to fight the chill. I pulled out my phone and quickly drafted the formal email to the Kansas City distributor outlining the revised recovery plan and strictly limiting Prairie Line's liability. I hit send, hoping the legal boundary would be enough to protect me. I put the car in gear and started the drive toward the warehouse. I planned to walk into Travis's office, hand him the revised delivery schedules, and force him to acknowledge that my company was saving his account. I expected resistance. I expected him to bluster and argue about the timeline. I did not expect my phone to buzz against the passenger seat before I even reached the city limits. I glanced down at the screen. The notification banner displayed a new text message. It was not from Travis. It was from my mother. The brief flash of the preview text made the blood freeze in my veins. I pulled the car over onto the narrow shoulder of the road, the gravel crunching loudly under the tires. I put the transmission in park and picked up the phone, staring at the message. "Travis told us you admitted the customer mess is yours. We are meeting at Grandpa's house tonight." I stared at the text message from my mother, the harsh glow of the screen illuminating the dark interior of my car. Travis had not just twisted my offer of a private rescue. He had actively weaponized it, running straight to Carol with a fabricated confession before the ink on my recovery plan was even dry. He was using the very lifeline I threw him to hang the entire supply chain disaster around my neck. I should have texted Carol back and told her the meeting was canceled. I should have driven straight to the farmhouse, locked the heavy front door, and ignored the headlights when they inevitably pulled into the driveway. But the deeply ingrained habit of managing my family's chaos took over. I wanted to look them in the eye and correct the lie before it metastasized any further into the extended family network. I wanted my father to hear the truth. That evening, the prairie darkness settled thick and cold around Leonard's farmhouse. The yellow porch light cast long, shifting shadows across the gravel as 4 vehicles pulled into the driveway. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the heavy boots on the wooden steps. I had left the front door unlocked. It was a mistake. The moment they crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. They did not enter like guests arriving at someone else's home. They walked in like an invading force reclaiming lost territory. Carol moved immediately to the kitchen counter, dropping a stack of flimsy paper plates and a plastic container of leftover funeral casserole next to the sink. She moved with the brisk, dismissive energy of a woman who fully believed she was still the matriarch of the property. Dennis followed her, keeping his gaze carefully trained on the old linoleum floor. Travis and Kendra walked in next, flanked by Aunt Phyllis, Uncle Ray, and my cousin Melanie. The kitchen quickly became cramped and suffocating. Travis did not look defeated or embarrassed by the catastrophic failure at the warehouse. He looked entirely vindicated, wearing a smug, practiced expression of weary disappointment. He leaned against the kitchen island, crossing his arms. "I am glad you finally came to your senses," Shelby Travis announced, his voice carrying the patronizing tone of an executive handling a subordinate. "Mom told everyone you finally admitted your outside company tangled the orders. It takes a big person to admit when they've made a mess of things. We can restructure the routing tomorrow and get Parker Prairie back on track." Aunt Phyllis nodded slowly, offering me a tight, sympathetic smile that felt like a physical strike. Uncle Ray sighed, shaking his head. They had swallowed the lie whole. Travis was actively changing the accusation in front of the audience, pivoting seamlessly from claiming I had abandoned the company to claiming we shared responsibility for a logistical failure I had caused. I looked at my father. Dennis stood near the refrigerator, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He knew Travis. He knew his son's history of reckless arrogance and frantic blame-shifting. I waited for him to speak up to question the glaring inconsistencies in Travis's story. Instead, Dennis looked up at me, his expression tight with discomfort. "Can you just fix this without embarrassing your brother?" Dennis asked softly. His voice barely carried over the hum of the refrigerator. "The family has been through enough this week, Shelby. Let's just smooth this out and keep the business moving." The quiet request cut deeper than any of Carol's loud accusations. My father was not confused by the logistics. He was not fooled by Travis's arrogant posturing. He knew the truth, and he was actively asking me to swallow the blame anyway. He wanted me to protect his son's fragile ego because maintaining the illusion of family peace was more important to him than my professional reputation. He was choosing the comfort of the lie over the reality of the truth. I reached across the counter and picked up the stack of paper plates my mother had just set down. I walked over to the kitchen table and dropped them next to the heavy brass keys resting on the scratched oak surface. I turned back to face the crowded room. "This is my house now," I stated, keeping my voice perfectly level, stripping away the soft, conciliatory tone I usually adopted around them. "If you are here, you listen. No one is authorized to enter Leonard's office or remove any files while you are on this property." Carol stiffened her hand, freezing halfway to the casserole container. Aunt Phyllis blinked, clearly startled by the sudden, rigid boundary. I looked directly at Travis. My offer to fix the outbound lanes was a rescue, not an admission. I clarified, speaking clearly enough that every relative in the room could hear the distinction. "You sold volume capacity that did not exist, and you used my company's name to secure the contracts without my permission. I am offering to salvage the holiday freight because the dock workers need their bonuses, not because I broke your supply chain." Travis opened his mouth, his face flushing a dull red, preparing to launch into a loud defensive counterattack. Before he could speak, a hesitant voice broke the tension. "That is not what you said yesterday, Travis." The entire room turned toward the hallway. Melanie was standing near the doorway, her arms wrapped tightly around her torso. She looked incredibly uncomfortable, shifting her weight nervously under the sudden heavy scrutiny of the family. She was usually the quietest cousin, the one who nodded along with Carol's gossip to avoid becoming the target. "What are you talking about, Melanie?" Carol snapped, her tone dripping with immediate hostility. Melanie did not look at my mother. She kept her eyes fixed on Travis. I was standing outside the kitchen yesterday. Before the funeral reception ended, Melanie said, her voice shaking slightly, but gaining strength with every word. I heard you talking to Kendra in the hallway. You said you didn't need to worry about the staging delays because Shelby would come back when the customers got loud. You said she always cleans up the mess if the pressure gets high enough. The air in the farmhouse kitchen seemed to evaporate. The confident, unified front my family had projected just moments ago fractured violently. Uncle Ray frowned, looking at Travis with sudden, sharp suspicion. Carol stared at Melanie, utterly speechless, having completely lost control of the narrative she had spent the last 2 days meticulously constructing. I looked at my father. I watched him process Melanie's statement. He heard the undeniable proof of premeditation. He heard that his son had not just made a mistake, but had actively planned to exploit my labor while publicly blaming me for the fallout. I waited for the realization to shift his loyalty. I waited for him to finally step forward and defend the daughter who had kept his father's company afloat. Dennis looked at the floor. He shifted his weight, his hands remaining stubbornly in his pockets. He stayed silent. The realization hit me with a cold, devastating finality. His silence was not born of confusion or a desire to understand all the facts. His silence was a deliberate choice. He was an active participant in the enabling. Travis realized the room was turning against him. He took a step toward Melanie, his aggressive posture returning. You are taking things out of context, Melanie. You don't understand how the warehouse operations work. Kendra stepped forward, stepping between Travis and the rest of the family. Her polished corporate facade was crumbling. She looked exhausted, her eyes darting nervously around the kitchen as the pressure of the lies finally overwhelmed her. She had been dragged into a logistics crisis she did not understand, forced to play the role of a manager while the floor collapsed underneath her. She turned on Travis, her voice rising in a sudden, frantic burst of defensive anger. "Don't put this on me, Travis." Kendra snapped her hands, trembling. "I told you the shipping manifests were a disaster on Monday. If you had not counted on Shelby covering the buffer, none of this would be happening right now." Kendra froze. Her mouth snapped shut. She stared at Travis, her eyes widening in immediate, terrified realization. She had let the phrase slip. She had spoken the internal shorthand aloud in front of the entire family. The silence that followed was not the quiet of shock. It was the heavy, expectant silence of a room waiting for an explosion. The tension from the farmhouse did not dissipate overnight. It followed me back to Selena, settling heavy and cold in the early morning air as I pulled into the employee parking lot at Parker Prairie Distribution. I walked through the steel side door, bypassed the front offices entirely, and headed straight for the break room. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. 2 forklift operators sat at a scratched folding table nursing thermoses of coffee before their shift began. Earl stood near the vending machine reviewing the payroll schedule taped to the wall. A few minutes later, Travis walked in. He looked exhausted, the manufactured confidence from the night before wearing thin. Kendra trailed closely behind him, clutching her clipboard as if it offered physical protection. They expected to find me organizing manifests or working quietly at a computer terminal, cleaning up the outbound lanes exactly as they had planned. I was standing by the dry erase board mounted near the refrigerator. I picked up a black marker. The squeak of the felt tip against the board drew the attention of the 2 workers at the table. I wrote a single word in bold, capitalized letters: buffer. I set the marker down and turned to face my brother. Travis stopped halfway across the room. Kendra froze beside him, her gaze dropping instantly to the scuffed linoleum floor. "What does that mean, Travis?" I asked. My voice was calm, carrying the precise professional tone I used when auditing a failed delivery route. "What is the Shelby buffer?" Travis shifted his weight, attempting to recover his authoritative posture. "I don't have time for a vocabulary lesson this morning. We have freight to move. I thought you came in to fix the Kansas City lanes." "I came in to understand the operational plan," I corrected him. I looked at Kendra, who was actively avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. "Kendra brought it up last night at the farmhouse. She said you counted on it." Travis let out a sharp, dismissive breath. She misspoke. She was stressed out because you have been confusing the clients and sabotaging the floor management. No, she didn't misspeak, Earl interrupted. The veteran floor manager stepped away from the wall. He reached into the pocket of his faded Carhartt jacket and pulled out his smartphone. He tapped the screen a few times and held it up for the room to see. I took this picture on Wednesday morning right after Travis fired you, and before Kendra erased the executive whiteboard. Earl said, his gravelly voice carrying across the quiet break room. He handed the phone to me. The screen displayed a clear, high-resolution photograph of the whiteboard in Travis's office. Underneath the impossible volume projections for the holiday accounts, scribbled in Travis's handwriting, was a specific operational note. Shelby buffer customer noise after funeral. The sheer calculation of those 6 words caused a physical ache in my chest. You are sharing internal planning documents with unauthorized personnel now, Earl. Travis snapped, his face flushing dark red. That is a breach of company policy. I should fire you right now for disloyalty. You can try, Earl replied, entirely unfazed. But I think the folks sitting at this table need to hear exactly how you plan to protect their holiday paychecks. I handed the phone back to Earl and looked at Travis. The full devastating reality of his strategy crystallized in my mind. I want everyone in this room who depended on my unnamed labor to say it plainly. I demanded, looking from Travis to Kendra. When neither of them spoke, Earl answered for them. You were the plan, Shelby, Earl stated, crossing his arms. He knew he couldn't cover the volume he promised to the regional distributors. He knew the staging lanes would back up and the customers would start screaming. He wrote it on the board. I turned my focus entirely to Kendra. The polished corporate facade had completely crumbled, leaving a terrified woman trapped in a logistics disaster she never signed up for. Is that true, Kendra? I asked quietly. Kendra looked at Travis, searching for a lifeline. When he looked away, she finally cracked. He assumed you would use your Prairie line contacts after the family brought you back around. Kendra admitted, her voice trembling slightly. He said you always got emotional about the warehouse workers losing their jobs. He told me that once the customers got loud enough, your mother would guilt you into coming back to fix the routing. You were supposed to absorb the overflow through your own company so Parker Prairie didn't take the hit for the delays. The hidden expectation was suddenly glaringly visible. My brother had not fired me in a fit of arrogant rage. He fired me because he wanted the title and the authority, fully planning to use my competence as an unpaid emergency resource after the damage peaked. He had weaponized my empathy. He knew I cared about the dock workers and the legacy of my grandfather's business, and he structured his entire holiday business plan around the assumption that I would sacrifice my own independent company to cover his failures. This cut deeper than the initial firing. They had discarded me publicly while quietly relying on my labor to sustain the illusion of their success. You all act like Shelby was not always going to come back, Travis muttered, attempting to sound dismissive, though the defense sounded incredibly weak even to his own ears. She needs this place just as much as we do. One of the dock workers sitting at the folding table, a young guy named Marcus, who had started just 6 months ago, stood up. He looked nervously between Travis and me. Are we getting paid this week? Marcus asked, his voice hesitant. Because if the Kansas City account pulls out, we don't have the volume to cover the holiday shifts. My wife is expecting that bonus. The question hit my most vulnerable emotional limitation. I looked at Marcus, seeing the genuine practical fear of a man trying to support his family. The overwhelming instinct to simply step in, fix the routing, and save the payroll surged forward. It would be so easy to bypass the family confrontation, sit at my terminal, and ensure the trucks moved by the end of the day. I almost agreed. I almost told Marcus not to worry, that I would handle the carriers. But I looked back at the dry erase board. I looked at the word buffer. If I rescued the company quietly right now, I was validating Travis's exact strategy. I was proving that his manipulation worked. I would save the workers today only to guarantee that Travis would exploit the same dynamic again next month. I squared my shoulders, forcing down the instinct to accommodate. I will not run a single pallet of freight through Prairie Line Logistics. I announced, keeping my voice firm and authoritative, unless responsibility for the delays and authority over the recovery routing are acknowledged in writing by both the customers and Parker Prairie leadership. I looked directly at Travis. I am not your buffer. I am an independent contractor. If you want my capacity, you sign my terms. Travis stared at me, the reality of his lost leverage finally sinking in. He had exposed his incompetence to the staff, and the safety net he had counted on was demanding a formal public accounting. Before Travis could formulate a response, the phone on the wall near the break room door rang loudly. Earl answered it. He listened for a few seconds, his expression darkening, before he held the receiver out toward the center of the room. "It's the buyer from the Wichita Farm Supply," Earl said, his voice echoing in the tense silence of the break room. "He says if they do not have a signed recovery plan by tonight, they are canceling every Parker Prairie order." The harsh buzz of the break room's fluorescent lights seemed to grow louder as Earl held out the phone receiver. The deadline was no longer a vague threat hanging over the end of the week. It was tonight. I took the phone from Earl. "This is Shelby. Give me 10 minutes to set up a conference bridge. We are going to map the recovery routing right now." I hung up before the Wichita buyer could argue. I turned back to the room. The young dock worker, Marcus, had retreated to the far wall, sensing the impending collision between family management and corporate reality. Kendra stood rigidly near the coffee machine, her arms crossed tight, while Travis glared at me, his jaw set in a stubborn defensive line. "Earl, get the Overland Park buyer on the video monitor," I instructed, pulling a stack of customer folders from my bag and dropping them onto the folding table. "Mark, grab a chair. We are doing this out in the open." Travis stepped forward, his boots scuffing heavily against the linoleum. "You cannot conduct high-level client negotiations in an employee break room." He objected, his tone laced with forced executive authority. "We take this to my office. We control the environment." "Your office is where the fake promises were made." "Travis," I said, not looking up as I uncapped a black dry erase marker, "we are doing this where the people who actually load the trucks can hear what is happening." I walked over to the dry erase board, wiping away the smudged pink remnants of Travis's impossible projections. The squeak of the marker was sharp and loud as I drew 2 vertical lines down the center of the white surface, dividing it into 3 distinct sections. At the top of the first column, I wrote available. Over the second, I wrote recoverable. Above the final column, I wrote impossible. "What is that?" Travis demanded, pointing at the third column. His face flushed a dark, angry red. "You do not write impossible in front of clients, Shelby. It projects weakness. It damages the brand. You cross that out and write delayed or rescheduled." I turned around, the marker still in my hand. Through the thin walls of the break room, the faint, steady beeping of a reversing forklift echoed from the staging lanes. "That word," I said, looking directly at my brother, "is why adults still answer their phones. When you tell a customer something is delayed, they hold their dock staff on overtime, waiting for a truck that is never coming. When you tell them a route is impossible, they can cancel the promotion and stop the bleeding. We are not selling them optimism today, Travis. We are giving them the math." The room went completely quiet. Mark, the Kansas City representative, nodded slowly from his chair at the folding table. He appreciated the brutal honesty. The video monitor on the far wall chimed as Earl connected the call with the Overland Park buyer, and the Wichita representative's voice crackled through the speakerphone, resting near my customer folders. I took operational control of the meeting. I did not ask for my brother's input, and I did not look to Kendra for administrative support. I relied on the 8 years of logistical data stored in my head and the capacity metrics from my independent Prairie Line dashboard. "Gentlemen," I addressed the room and the screens. "The holiday staging lanes were mismanaged. The volume projections you were given on Tuesday cannot be honored under the current Parker Prairie fleet capacity. If you stay on this bridge, you are agreeing to a revised recovery plan that I will personally supervise." I moved to the board. Column 1, available. I have 3 drivers currently sitting empty in Salina. I can authorize them under Prairie Line contracts to pick up the priority perishable pallets for Kansas City by 1400 hours today. I wrote the routing numbers under the first heading. Column 2. Recoverable. I continued pacing slightly as I laid out the strategy. The dry goods for Wichita and Overland Park are currently buried behind inbound receiving. I need Earl's team on double overtime to dig them out. If you grant us a 48-hour extension, Prairie Line will absorb the carrier rate difference, and we will land those shipments by Thursday morning. I paused, letting the harsh reality of the final column settle before I spoke. Exposing the company's failure in front of our most lucrative clients was painful. I hated showing weakness. I hated admitting that my grandfather's business had faltered. But covering for Travis's ego was exactly how the staging lanes had become a disaster in the first place. Column 3, I said, tapping the marker against the board. Impossible. The promotional overflow items, the secondary display units. I cannot secure the capacity to move them before the holiday weekend without violating federal driving hours. Parker Prairie will issue full refunds for the unfulfilled freight by close of business today. Refunds! Travis practically shouted, stepping toward the board. Do you have any idea what that does to the quarterly revenue? You are gutting the margins just to prove a point? The speakerphone buzzed as the Wichita buyer cut in. If she doesn't gut the margins on the overflow, Travis, I will pull the entire account and sue Parker Prairie for breach of contract. I am accepting this recovery plan specifically because Shelby is standing in front of the board. The video monitor flickered as the Overland Park buyer unmuted his microphone. Agreed. We will sign the revised delivery acknowledgments this afternoon, but the paperwork needs to clearly state that Prairie Line Logistics is managing the recovery. We are not relying on the Parker name right now. The shift in authority was absolute, and it happened entirely within business circles. The clients did not care about the title printed on my brother's business cards. They cared about the person who could accurately calculate a freight lane. Travis was watching his corporate credibility evaporate in real time. I handed Mark the physical folders containing the revised routing schedules. He reviewed the top page, his tense posture relaxing slightly as he saw concrete, realistic delivery windows. I need your signature here, I told Mark, pointing to the bottom of the page. This legally distinguishes Prairie Line's limited assistance from the unauthorized guarantees made earlier this week. Mark signed the document without hesitation. He stood up, shook my hand, and walked out of the break room. The video feed disconnected, and Earl ended the speakerphone call. The immediate crisis was contained. The dock workers would keep their jobs, the essential holiday freight would move, and Parker Prairie distribution would survive the week. Travis stared at the 3 columns on the dry erase board. He realized the customers had just publicly bypassed his authority, choosing to trust my independent company over his leadership. But Travis was a man who measured his worth primarily through his social standing, not his operational competence. Losing a freight contract hurt his ego, but losing his public reputation would destroy him. "You think this makes you the savior?" Travis muttered, his voice dropping to a bitter defensive whisper. "You just humiliated this company in front of its biggest clients. Wait until Mom tells the rest of the family how you handled this. You are going to look like a vindictive, power-hungry vulture." He turned on his heel and walked out of the break room, Kendra hurrying after him. I stood by the whiteboard staring at the word impossible. I had accepted the operational responsibility Leonard left me, choosing to save the business while refusing to absorb the blame Travis tried to assign me. I had drawn the professional boundary, but the family narrative remained entirely under my mother's control. Earl walked over, picking up my empty coffee thermos from the table. "You fixed the lanes, Shelby," he said quietly, "but you know they aren't going to let this go. They will spin this." "I know," I said, capping the dry erase marker. I gathered my folders and walked out to the parking lot. The biting wind had picked up again, swirling dry dust across the gravel. I climbed into my car, the cold seeping through my coat as I turned the key in the ignition. My phone buzzed in the center console. I glanced down at the screen. A new voicemail icon flashed, accompanied by a transcription preview. It was a message from Carol. I pressed play, letting her voice fill the freezing car. "Pastor Linda says people are asking questions," my mother's voice announced, thick with preemptive hostility. "You are causing a scandal, Shelby. Be at church on Sunday and do not make your mother look like a liar." The fellowship hall in the basement of the First Presbyterian Church of Salina always smelled the same, a distinct mix of commercial percolated coffee, sugary vanilla sheet cake, and the musty paper scent of old hymnals stacked in the corner. It was Sunday morning. The service had just ended, and the congregation was filtering downstairs for the weekly coffee hour. I walked into the basement, keeping my winter coat buttoned. The heavy brass keys in my pocket brushed against my thigh with every step. I did not want to be here. My instinct was to drive back to Wichita, bury myself in prairie line contracts, and avoid my mother's performance entirely. But I knew ignoring the voicemail would only validate the narrative Carol was currently weaving through the pews. My mother had chosen this specific room because she felt powerful here. She relied on the unwritten rules of Midwestern church manners, the polite smiles, the avoidance of loud conflict, the deference to grieving widows to ensure her version of the truth went unchallenged. I spotted her immediately. Carol was standing near the long folding tables serving as the refreshment station. She was surrounded by 3 older women from the congregation, women who had known my grandfather for decades. Dennis stood a half step behind her, holding a styrofoam cup of black coffee, maintaining his usual compliant silence. Across the room, Travis and Kendra were holding court near the folding chairs, accepting sympathetic pats on the shoulder and speaking in hushed, somber tones. Travis was playing the role of the grieving heir, bearing a heavy, tragic burden. I walked toward the coffee urn, staying close to the painted cinderblock wall. I could hear my mother's voice carrying over the ambient chatter. Grief just changed Shelby. Carol sighed, placing a hand over her heart. She looked at the church women with an expression of profound, weary sadness. We all loved Leonard so much. We are all hurting. But she is pushing the family away. She locked the farmhouse. She is demanding control over the business accounts, while Travis is just trying to keep the trucks running for his grandfather's sake. One of the older women shook her head, offering a sympathetic cluck of her tongue. It is a shame, Carol. Money does terrible things to people when they are hurting. I stopped a few feet away, my jaw tight. She was standing in a room full of people who had just buried Leonard, recasting my grief as greed. She was using his memory to paint herself as a victim, insulating Travis from the business disaster he had created just 3 days ago. Before I could decide whether to confront her or turn around and walk out the door, a hand touched my arm. I turned. Pastor Linda Cho stood beside me. She held a church bulletin in her hand, her expression entirely neutral. Pastor Linda had presided over Leonard's funeral. She knew the Parker family well, and she understood the subtle, sharp currents that ran beneath the polite surface of Sunday morning coffee hours. "Shelby," Pastor Linda said quietly, steering me a few steps away from the serving tables, creating a small pocket of privacy. "I am glad you came today. I know the room feels heavy right now." I looked over at my mother, who was still talking to her captive audience. "It feels like a courtroom pastor." Pastor Linda followed my gaze. She did not offer empty religious platitudes. She offered a memory. "Your grandfather sat in my office a few months before his health declined," Pastor Linda murmured, keeping her voice low. "We were talking about the church roof repairs, and the conversation turned to his warehouse. He told me he wasn't worried about the business lasting. I remember his exact words. He said, 'Travis looks good in the suit, but that girl keeps the wheels turning.'" The validation struck me hard, catching me off guard. Leonard had seen me. He had recognized the invisible labor I poured into Parker Prairie, and he had spoken of it to someone outside the family. "He trusted you, Shelby," Pastor Linda added gently. I realized my mother had stopped talking. Carol had spotted me standing with the pastor. The polite, grieving facade slipped for a fraction of a second, replaced by a sharp, calculating glare. She recognized the danger of me speaking privately with the one person in the room who held moral authority over the congregation. If Pastor Linda began to doubt the family narrative, Carol's entire social strategy would collapse. Carol needed to bring the conversation into the open, where she believed the pressure of church decorum would silence me. She stepped away from the serving table, raising her voice so it carried clearly across the linoleum floor. "If Shelby has something to say," Carol announced, the sweet, wounded tone returning to her voice as she addressed the room, She can say it in front of people who loved her grandfather. We do not need to hide in corners. We are a family in mourning. The conversations around the fellowship hall sputtered and died. The clinking of spoons against styrofoam cups ceased. Dozens of faces turned toward me. Aunt Phyllis and Uncle Ray, sitting near the back, sat up straighter. Travis stopped talking to his group, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the sudden shift in attention. My mother had laid the trap perfectly. If I yelled at her, I was the unstable, bitter daughter disrespecting a holy space. If I stayed silent, I confirmed her accusation that I was hiding something shameful. My hand moved to the pocket of my coat, my fingers brushing against the cold brass keys. I hated public confrontation. I had spent my entire life avoiding scenes like this, preferring to fix problems quietly in the background. But private correction had failed. My silence at the farmhouse had allowed Carol to steal the narrative, and my private rescue at the warehouse had allowed Travis to retain his unearned pride. I looked at Pastor Linda. I did not ask her to intervene or defend me. I asked for the room. "Pastor," I said, my voice steady though my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "I do not want to argue about money in this basement, but I need 2 minutes to correct the record regarding who my grandfather trusted with his legacy." Pastor Linda looked at me, then looked at my mother. She understood exactly what Carol was trying to do, and she chose neutrality that favored the truth. She stepped back, opening the floor, permitting me the space to speak. I turned to face my mother and the silent, watching congregation. "I locked the farmhouse, Mom, because I am the sole owner of the property," I stated. My voice was clear, stripped of the defensive anxiety she expected. "I took operational control of the warehouse accounts because Travis sold freight capacity that did not exist, and the clients threatened to cancel every contract unless I stepped in to fix the staging lanes." Carol's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "You are twisting a difficult week to make your brother look bad," she snapped, abandoning the wounded tone entirely. "You are trying to take advantage of Leonard's passing." "I am trying to keep the trucks running," I countered, looking past her to where Travis stood frozen near the folding chairs, just like Grandpa trusted me to do. "Leonard was sick, Shelby." Travis interjected, his voice tight, stepping forward to defend his mother. "He was not thinking clearly at the end. You manipulated him." The accusation hung in the air, desperate and cruel. They were willing to paint Leonard as mentally incompetent, rather than admit he had intentionally bypassed his golden grandson. Before I could answer the insult, the heavy wooden doors at the top of the basement stairs opened. The sound of solid footsteps echoed down the stairwell. Janet Whitcomb stepped into the fellowship hall. She wore her dark wool coat, her expression unreadable. She walked down the final few steps and into the silent room. She held a slim silver digital voice recorder in her right hand. Janet stopped a few feet from the serving tables. She looked at Carol, then at Travis. "If we are going to talk about what Leonard wanted," Janet said, her voice cutting through the tension with absolute, undeniable authority, "we should use Leonard's words." Janet walked past Carol and set the slim silver recorder on the folding table, resting it evenly between the humming coffee urn and the half-eaten vanilla sheet cake. Carol's eyes widened. She reached out as if to block the device, the aggressive confidence draining from her posture. "Janet, stop. This is a church basement. This is not the place to play estate files." Pastor Linda stepped forward, her hands clasped softly in front of her. "You made it the place, Carol." Janet did not offer a preamble. She did not explain probate law or trust mechanics. She simply pressed the play button. A sharp crackle of static echoed from the small speaker, followed by the sound of a throat clearing. Then Leonard Parker's voice filled the fellowship hall. It was strong, clear, and unmistakably grounded in the practical gravel of a man who had spent 40 years running diesel fleets. "Travis likes the view from the desk," Leonard's recorded voice stated. "He likes taking the clients to lunch. But a logistics company doesn't survive on handshakes. It survives on accuracy. Travis thinks a promise is a purchase order. Shelby understands the difference." A few chairs scraped loudly against the linoleum as several older church members shifted, absorbing the blunt assessment from the man they had just buried. I stared at the recorder, my chest tightening. I had known Leonard trusted me, but hearing him say it aloud, defending my competence while acknowledging my brother's fatal flaw, felt like a physical weight lifting off my shoulders. I am leaving Parker Prairie Distribution to Shelby. The recording continued the cadence steady and resolute. The company needs the person who keeps the freight moving when nobody is clapping. She will hate the conflict it causes. She will try to fix the damage quietly to protect her parents, but she is the only one who won't let the truck stop. The audio cut out with a sharp click. Janet removed her finger from the device. That statement was recorded during his formal competency evaluation 18 months ago. Janet clarified her tone, mild and factual. The silence in the basement was absolute. The room absorbed the validation. Leonard had not been confused. He had anticipated the exact pattern playing out right now. He knew Travis would break the company, he knew I would try to fix it privately, and he knew my parents would blame me for the fallout. Travis stepped out from the cluster of folding chairs. His face was pale, his jaw set in a frantic defensive line. He was medicated. Travis insisted, his voice rising, trying to regain the ground he felt slipping away. He was confused. You all know how he got at the end. Shelby was in his ear, manipulating him. No, a voice answered from the back of the room. Melanie stepped forward, moving away from Aunt Phyllis. She did not look nervous anymore. She looked deeply, profoundly tired of the lie. You were the one clearing files from his office before the funeral, Travis. You told Kendra to get the staging manifests out of the house before Janet arrived. Travis flushed a dark, angry red. Melanie, you don't know what you're talking about. I unbuttoned my winter coat. I reached into the deep interior pocket and pulled out the thick manila folder I had carried from the warehouse the day before. I did not make a long, emotional speech. I walked over to the folding table and set the packet down right beside Leonard's recorder. I should have corrected this before my mother turned it into prayer chain gossip, I said, looking around the room, acknowledging the people who had watched me grow up. That was my mistake. I tried to handle the operational failure privately because I didn't want to embarrass my family during a funeral week. I opened the folder, revealing the printed photograph of the dry erase board and the revised delivery acknowledgments signed by the regional buyers. But this is what my grandfather was protecting the company from, I said, tapping the photo of the board. Travis sold capacity. We did not have guaranteed holiday delivery windows that were physically impossible, and then wrote my name on his whiteboard, planning to use my independent business to bail him out when the customers realized he lied. A man sitting near the back wall stood up. Mark, the Kansas City customer representative, had attended the service at Pastor Linda's invitation, representing a corporate relationship that spanned 2 generations of the Parker family. Mark did not walk to the front. He spoke clearly from where he stood. Travis explicitly told my purchasing department that Prairie Line Logistics stood behind his holiday timeline. He used Shelby's name without her direct permission. If she had not stepped in on Friday and completely restructured the routing, we would have pulled $1 million contract from Parker Prairie by noon. The room stopped defending Travis. The church ladies who had been nodding sympathetically with my mother just minutes ago were now staring at the floor or looking actively away from her. Aunt Phyllis pressed a hand to her mouth. Uncle Ray shook his head, the reality of the business risk finally outweighing his instinct to protect the eldest son. Carol looked around the fellowship hall, searching for an ally. She found none. The room she had chosen to host my public execution had turned into a tribunal for her own deceit. She had demanded I speak in front of the people who loved Leonard, and Leonard's own words had answered her. Dennis stood by the coffee urn, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at the recorder, then at the manila folder, and finally at me. He had spent his entire life remaining silent, enabling Carol's control and Travis's arrogance, choosing the path of least resistance. Shelby Dennis started, his voice cracking, lacking any of the smooth authority he usually projected. I did not know it was that bad. I thought Travis was just overwhelmed. Carol reached out, grabbing his forearm tightly. Dennis, stop. She is humiliating us. This time Dennis did not nod. He did not look at the floor. He looked at the fingers digging into his sleeve. Slowly, deliberately, Dennis pulled his arm away from her hand. The hum of the warehouse floor the next morning felt different. The chaotic, frantic energy from the previous week had vanished, replaced by a tense, focused rhythm. Forklifts beeped methodically down the concrete aisles, loading the recovered dry goods onto the outbound trucks I had secured. I stood near the employee time clock with Janet watching Earl direct a crew wrapping the final Kansas City pallets. The heavy steel side door swung open, hitting the cinder block wall with a harsh metallic clang. Travis walked in his expensive winter coat, unbuttoned, his face set in a tight, combative scowl. Kendra followed him, her posture rigid, clutching her purse with both hands. Travis did not greet the staff. He marched directly toward the administrative hallway, expecting the sea of workers to part for him. He reached for the doorknob of the main executive office, rattling it impatiently when it did not turn. He pulled a set of keys from his pocket, his frustration visibly mounting as he fumbled with the lock. The brass key ring in my own coat pocket felt heavy. The locks had been changed at 6 o'clock that morning. Earl stepped away from the staging lanes, crossing the floor to stand firmly between Travis and the office door. Earl did not say a word. He just stood there, crossing his thick, canvas-clad arms, an immovable physical barrier. Travis glared at the older man. "Get out of my way, Earl. I need to get to my desk. We have regional buyers demanding updates." "The buyers have their updates," I said, walking over to join Earl. Travis spun around. He looked at me, then at Janet standing quietly by the time clock. His bravado flickered the reality of the church basement confrontation, finally bleeding into his professional domain. "You think a recording in a church gives you the right to lock me out of my own office?" Travis demanded, though his voice lacked its usual booming resonance. "You cannot just seize a commercial operation because you feel slighted." Janet stepped forward, her dark wool coat sharp against the industrial setting. Under the terms of Leonard's finalized business trust, she stated, her tone precise and unyielding, "Shelby possesses sole executive authority to change management access. You are removed from operational control, Travis, effective immediately." Travis stared at the closed office door, the realization settling over him. He was no longer the protected heir. The family hierarchy that had insulated him from consequence his entire life did not extend to this concrete floor. Kendra let out a slow, shaky breath. She looked at the closed office, then at the workers watching from the staging lanes. She reached into her purse, pulled out her plastic employee badge, and walked over to the small table in the break room doorway. She set the badge down on the laminate surface. "I was never trained for this," Kendra said quietly, not looking at Travis. "I thought we were just managing the accounts. I cannot handle the supply chain." She turned and walked out the steel side door, leaving the building without waiting for my brother. Travis watched her go, his jaw clenching. He turned his resentment fully onto me, his eyes bitter and hard. "You got everything, didn't you, Shelby? You got the farmhouse, the company, the staff. You took it all." I looked at him, feeling a strange, profound exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. Winning this battle did not feel like a triumphant revenge fantasy. It felt like walking into a beloved familiar room after someone else had deliberately trashed it, knowing I would be the one sweeping up the broken glass. "No, Travis," I answered, keeping my voice steady. "I got the responsibility you ran from." I turned to Earl. "You are the floor manager now, Earl. I want the Kansas City trucks dispatched by noon. Any driver questions come directly to me." Earl nodded, a grim smile touching the corners of his mouth. He turned back to the staging lanes, signaling the forklift operators to resume loading. Travis lingered for a moment longer, standing in the hallway without a badge, without an office, and without an audience willing to indulge his ego. The workers simply moved around him, returning to the rhythm of the freight. Slowly, deliberately, he turned and walked out the door, the heavy steel clicking shut behind him. I watched him leave, feeling a sudden sharp pang of guilt. The deeply ingrained instinct to soften the blow for my family flared up, urging me to call my father to check if Dennis was okay after pulling away from Carol's grip. I wanted to believe that one moment of resistance meant he was finally ready to choose the truth over the performance. But I kept my hand away from my phone. Reopening the door out of guilt would only invite the chaos back inside. My correction had to be behavioral, not just emotional. I pulled the brass key ring from my pocket and unlocked the door to Grandpa Leonard's old office. The room smelled of old paper, strong coffee, and decades of quiet, steady work. I walked in, leaving the door open to the warehouse floor. Janet followed me inside. She reached into her leather folder and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. The paper was slightly yellowed, bearing my name written in Leonard's unmistakable heavy cursive. "He told me to hold this," Janet said, handing the envelope across the desk. "He said, 'Open after the first hard decision.'" I sat alone at the farmhouse kitchen table 3 days after the confrontation on the warehouse floor. The house was quiet, the heavy silence of the prairie pressing against the window panes. The brass key ring rested on the scratched oak surface right beside Grandpa Leonard's old ceramic coffee mug. I picked up the thick, sealed envelope Janet had handed me. My name was written across the front in Leonard's bold, slanted handwriting. I slid my thumb under the flap and broke the seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery and a small, stiff square of plastic. I pulled the plastic out first. It was a $1 bill laminated and worn at the corners. Faint blue ink across the top margin read, "First rail transfer, April 1984. I set the dollar down and unfolded the letter. "Shelby," the letter began. 30 years ago, a brutal harvest season nearly put a permanent padlock on the warehouse doors. We were bleeding cash, and the bank was ready to pull our credit. We survived that winter for one reason. Someone finally sat down at this exact kitchen table and honestly counted the damage instead of telling the loan officers a comfortable lie. I have watched your brother sell comfortable lies his entire life. I watched your parents encourage him to do it. I knew exactly what would happen when I was gone. They thought you were just the safety net. They thought you were a buffer, someone who would quietly absorb the impact so Travis could stand on the stage and take the applause. But you were never the backup plan kid. You were the only person I trusted to look at the ledger, count the damage, and tell the truth. Keep the trucks moving. I read the words until they blurred. For years I had bent over backward trying to prove my worth to my mother and father, hoping that if I just worked hard enough they would finally see me as an equal to Travis. I had desperately wanted their validation. I looked at the letter in my hands. The urge to pick up my phone, take a picture of Leonard's words, and send it directly to Carol flared up in my chest. I wanted her to see it. I wanted to prove definitively that I was chosen. I reached for my phone. Then I stopped. I looked at the brass keys on the table. My mother would never read this letter and apologize. She would claim Leonard was manipulated, or she would find a way to twist the words to make herself the victim. Sending it to her was just another way of begging for her approval. I did not need her approval anymore. Leonard had chosen me, and I had chosen to stay and do the work. I folded the letter, picked up the laminated dollar, and walked down the hallway into my grandfather's office. I placed the dollar in the top drawer of the heavy mahogany desk and set the letter right beside it. I closed the drawer, turned off the light, and walked out. 2 months later, the air inside Parker Prairie Distribution smelled of smoked brisket and sweet barbecue sauce. We had cleared a wide space near the break room, pulling together 3 long folding tables. It was Friday afternoon, and the warehouse floor was buzzing with a light, easy energy. Customer shipments had stabilized within the first 2 weeks of implementing the revised routing terms. The Kansas City and Overland Park distributors signed new transparent contracts directly under my management. The impossible promises Travis made were scrubbed from the ledgers, and the dock workers were finally operating on realistic, predictable schedules. I stood near the edge of the tables, holding a paper plate, watching the people gathered in the room. Earl was laughing at a joke told by one of the new forklift operators. Janet Whitcomb sat next to Pastor Linda Cho, the two of them deep in a quiet, pleasant conversation about the upcoming winter charity drive. My cousin Melanie stood near the coffee machine, chatting easily with the shift leads. It did not look like a corporate networking event. It did not look like the tense, performative holiday dinners my mother used to orchestrate. It looked like a community. It was a circle built entirely out of people who had chosen to tell the truth. I set my plate down on a nearby pallet as my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and checked the screen. It was a text message from a distant cousin on my mother's side. "Hi, Shelby. Your mom asked me to reach out. She is hosting Thanksgiving at the new condo next week. She says the door is open if you are ready to put everything behind us. Carol was still trying to control the narrative. She was using a proxy to extend an invitation, framing it as a generous pardon for my supposed transgressions. She wanted me to walk into her home and pretend the public smear campaign, the lockouts, and the stolen credit had never happened. I did not type out a long explanation. I did not justify my boundaries or defend my actions. "No, thank you," I typed. "I hope you all have a good holiday." I hit send. There was no anxiety, no lingering fear of the gossip that would inevitably follow. I slipped the phone back into my pocket. A moment later, it buzzed again. I assumed it was the cousin pressing the issue, but when I looked at the screen, the caller ID showed my father's name. Dennis had not spoken a word to me since the moment he pulled his arm away from Carol's grip in the church basement. The message was brief. "Shelby, can we get a cup of coffee this week, just us? I would like to talk." I stared at the text. The old familiar tug of hope pulled at my chest. He had carried my suitcase out into the cold, but he had also finally refused to back Carol's public lie. He was a man who had spent 30 years choosing the path of least resistance, and he was finally standing outside the fortress my mother had built around Travis. I did not want to be a person who slammed the door forever, but I also knew that opening the door without a lock was how the house got robbed in the first place. I had to correct the old pattern. I had to ensure that any relationship moving forward was based on reality, not on my willingness to be useful. I tapped the screen and typed my reply. "We can get coffee, Dad, but we are not going to talk about Travis, and we are not going to discuss the company. If either of those things comes up, I will leave. Let me know if Tuesday works." I watched the text bubble turn blue, delivering the condition. I did not know if he would accept the terms, and for the first time in my life, I was entirely okay with whatever choice he made. The boundary was set, the rest was up to him. I walked away from the tables and headed toward the open dock doors at the far end of the warehouse. The late afternoon sun was beginning to dip low over the Kansas prairie, casting long golden shadows across the concrete. A heavy diesel engine roared to life in the staging yard. I watched as a fully loaded semi-truck pulled away from dock door 4, its air brakes hissing as it slowly navigated the gravel turn toward the county highway. The trailer was packed with outbound freight, moving on a schedule that was honest, verified, and secure. I slipped my hand into my coat pocket. My fingers wrapped around the cold, heavy metal of the brass key ring. It was no longer just a symbol of being thrown out into the cold, and it was no longer just an intimidating piece of inherited property. It was the physical proof that I decided who had access to the life and the work my grandfather trusted me to protect. I pulled my phone out of my other pocket and set it face down on a nearby stack of wooden pallets. I leaned against the steel frame of the dock door, listening to the truck tires hit the pavement, watching the dust settle into the quiet, fading light of the prairie. I want to know what you would have done if you were in my shoes. Would you have kept the business and fought for the warehouse, or would you have sold it all to escape the family drama? Would you have answered that final text from Dennis, or would you have cut ties with everyone completely? Let me know down in the comments. Tell me where you are listening from, and thank you so much for spending your time with me today.